The morning after the raid, the lagoon was eerily still. The only sound was the creak of ruined ships shifting in the tide and the faint crackle of fires that refused to die. Black plumes hung over the anchorage like a funeral shroud, the acrid smell of burning oil reaching miles out to sea. At the edge of the dock, Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Endo stood with his hands behind his back, the salt wind pushing at his cap. He had seen damage before, shrapnel tears, fuel fires, shattered turrets, but nothing like this. The Kiyosumi Maru had been struck once, dead center, and within seconds had erupted into a white column of fire so fierce it fused the deck plates. "A single bomb," he murmured. "Not a magazine hit, just one." Nearby, divers from the 2nd Salvage Unit tightened the straps of their suits. Their orders were simple: retrieve whatever they could find of the American ordnance. The enemy had dropped hundreds of 500-pound bombs, but most had vanished into the depths or detonated completely. Only fragments remained unless they were lucky. By mid-morning, the first diver surfaced, spluttering as he pulled himself onto the barge. In his hands was a waterlogged steel section, curved, heavy, with an opening at one end. Endo knelt beside it as the man laid it down on the deck. "Careful," Endo said. "That could still have a detonator attached." The diver shook his head. "No explosives, sir. It's hollow. But look, wires." Endo blinked. Inside the broken casing, a tangle of thin copper strands coiled around a small glass tube. It was not mechanical. No pins, no plungers. Something else. Something electrical. "Wiring," he said quietly. "Inside a bomb." He glanced up toward the smoke-choked horizon where the raid had come from. The Americans. Their aircraft had moved with precision, their bombs striking almost perfectly on target. Japanese ordnance officers had long dismissed rumors of instantaneous fuses as Allied propaganda. But the wrecks around him told a different story. Truk, Anchorage. February 18th, 1,943 recovered ordnance fragments suggest a new type of American bomb fuse employing electrical or magnetic components. Design unknown. Recommend immediate shipment to Tokyo Technical Arsenal for study. That afternoon, Endo oversaw the retrieval of 2 more pieces. One was the front cone of a 500-pound bomb, the other, the tail plug with faint markings in English. When the metal dried in the sun, letters appeared: M103, a 1 fuse. The discovery sent a low murmur through the officers gathered around the crate. Captain Sato, the harbour commander, frowned. "So they've begun marking their weapons in code now?" Endo shook his head. "No, sir. These aren't codes. They're designations." He pointed to the threads of copper within the casing. "This is not a percussion device. It reacts on impact through electrical contact. The circuit completes the instant the nose hits faster than any mechanical delay." Sato crossed his arms. "Then how do we defend against it?" Endo didn't answer. He knew the truth. There was no defense against physics. That night, the base was silent. What few lights still worked flickered dimly through the humid dark. In his quarters, Endo sat over a lantern with the recovered fragments spread across a cloth. He took careful notes in his logbook, the handwriting neat and deliberate. Material quality, exceptional machined steel of high tensile strength. Internal components suggest use of copper conductors and non-ferrous contacts. Not compatible with Japanese manufacturing methods under current resource restrictions. He paused, rubbing his temples. "They're building these by the thousands," he said softly. Outside, rain began to fall slow, warm drops that hissed when they struck the smouldering wrecks in the harbour. Endo closed his eyes for a moment, hearing the faint echo of explosions from the day before. He could still see the Katori, disintegrating in mid-broadside, the ship's gunners vaporized before they even saw the flash. The Americans' bombs didn't just destroy, they erased. After the raid, Endo stopped talking to anyone but his notebook. He stared at that piece of metal for hours. I remember him saying, "We are fighting an enemy who invents faster than we can understand." We thought he was being dramatic. He wasn't. 3 days later, under overcast skies, a transport vessel prepared to depart for Yokosuka. The crate containing the bomb fragments was lashed to the deck, sealed under 3 layers of tarpaulin. Endo stood beside it, watching as sailors secured the final bolts. "You'll guard this shipment with your life," he told the escort officer. "If it reaches Tokyo intact, perhaps they can tell us what we're really fighting." The officer nodded, uncertain. "What do you think it is, sir?" "A new explosive." Endo looked toward the grey Pacific, his face expressionless. "No, not the explosive, the trigger." He turned and walked back toward the harbour's edge, where the water lapped quietly against the twisted hull of a sunken freighter. Beneath the surface, faint bubbles rose from ruptured fuel tanks, ghostly reminders of how fast everything had happened. He wrote one final note before dusk. Conclusion: the Americans possess instantaneous electrical fusing mechanisms capable of detonation at the exact moment of impact. Impact energy appears converted into electric impulse. Recommend immediate reproduction attempts at Tokyo Arsenal. This device alone could explain catastrophic single-hit detonations observed during recent raids. He closed the logbook and placed it inside his coat. As the transport ship steamed out of the lagoon, a dull rumble echoed from somewhere far off thunder, or perhaps another distant raid. Endo didn't look back. He knew that what lay in that crate was more valuable than any warship. It was the answer to a question no one had dared to ask. Why were their ships dying so fast? Recent field reports confirm exceptional effectiveness of the M103, a one-electric impact fuse in tropical operations. Instantaneous detonation improves target lethality, particularly against naval vessels and fortified hangars. Recommend continued deployment. Endo would never see that report, of course. But he didn't need to. Standing on the ruined pier, the night air thick with oil smoke, he understood perfectly well what it meant. For the first time since the war began, he felt a creeping suspicion that Japan was not merely outnumbered, they were out-engineered. He looked down at his hands, still smelling faintly of machine oil and sea salt, and whispered to no one in particular. Somewhere, across that horizon, a man designed this. He may never see the war, but his work, his mind is killing us faster than any pilot. The wind off the lagoon carried the words away, scattering them across the black water. In their place, the ocean answered only with silence, the same silence that always followed discovery. And in that silence, Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Endo made a vow to find out how the Americans had built a bomb that could think faster than men could pray. Snow drifted across the rail yard at Shinagawa as the morning freight train clattered into the capital. The crates bore no markings, only stenciled codes and red seals from the Imperial Navy. Men in heavy coats moved with urgency, their breath white in the cold air. Among the cargo was a long, narrow box labelled Technical Priority Naval Ordnance Division. Inside, the fragments from Truk. By noon, the box was delivered to Tokyo Technical Arsenal No. 3, a sprawling compound of concrete buildings half hidden behind blackout curtains and camouflaged netting. Engineers there had seen nearly every piece of captured Allied technology since 1941. Machine guns, radios, even fragments of radar equipment, but nothing like this. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Endo arrived 2 days later, his uniform still smelling faintly of salt and engine oil. He handed over his field notes to the head of research, Dr. Masaru Kuroda, a civilian engineer with the quiet precision of a watchmaker. Kuroda adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, skimming the pages. Electrical detonation on impact, Kuroda murmured. Impossible. I thought so too, Endo said, until I saw the results myself. They stood over the workbench where the fragments lay beneath bright lamps. The copper coils gleamed faintly, untouched by rust despite weeks at sea. Kuroda reached for a small tool, prying loose the remnants of a glass capsule. Inside was a silver thread no thicker than a hair. This isn't Japanese, Kuroda said. It's American. Preliminary findings indicate utilization of piezoelectric element or electrical impact conductor. Unknown material, possibly quartz-based, converts kinetic energy into current, initiating detonation with negligible delay. Device is compact, reliable, and impossible to replicate with current domestic supplies. For the next 3 nights, the lab burned with light. Engineers in grey uniforms dismantled each recovered piece, mapping its geometry with calipers and magnifiers. Every fragment told a story. Precision, machining, tight tolerances, materials drawn from industries Japan could no longer sustain. Kuroda's assistants whispered among themselves, how had the Americans achieved this level of miniaturization? Japan's own fuses were bulky brass contraptions, prone to failure under tropical humidity. Yet here lay a design that defied both size and logic. At one corner of the table, Endo kept silent, watching as the disassembled bomb casing was laid out in a perfect arc of ruin. He had expected confirmation. Instead, he found a puzzle that deepened with every discovery. Finally, Kuroda broke the silence. Do you realize what this means? If they can produce these by the thousands, their bombing efficiency will double. Endo nodded. And our ships will last half as long. Tokyo, Arsenal. Requests additional samples from South Pacific operations. Recovered fragments from Truk insufficient for complete replication. Recommend field units preserve unexploded ordnance when possible. Priority level. Urgent strategic implication. On March 11th, Endo was summoned to the Navy Ministry for briefing. The meeting room smelled faintly of tobacco and damp paper. Maps of the Pacific lined the walls, Solomon's, New Guinea, the Marshalls, each marked with red circles of loss. Vice Admiral Hasegawa presided at the head of the table, his eyes heavy with fatigue. Lieutenant Commander Endo, he began. Your report from Truk has reached the Naval General Staff. They are disturbed. Endo bowed slightly. Yes, sir. Explain to us, Hasegawa continued. In simple terms, what makes these American bombs so destructive? Endo took a breath. It's not their size or explosive yield. It's their speed of detonation. The fuse reacts electrically instantly on contact. There is no delay. No chance for armor or spacing to absorb impact. The energy transfers directly into the structure. The result, he hesitated, is what we saw at Truk. A single strike. Total destruction. The Admiral exchanged glances with his aides. Can we build such a fuse ourselves? Kuroda, seated nearby, adjusted his glasses. Not yet. We lack the piezoelectric crystals and the precision instruments for mass production. Even our copper supply is limited. What the Americans have done is industrial sorcery. The room fell silent. Rain tapped faintly against the windows. Finally, Hasegawa exhaled through his nose. Then we must find another way to fight them. If we cannot match their technology, we must unmake their advantage. That night, back at the arsenal, Endo walked the empty corridors, the sound of rain echoing off the concrete. He entered the lab and stopped before the dissected bomb parts once more. He reached out, tracing the cold edge of the copper ring. Who are you? He whispered, as though the weapon itself might answer. He thought of the unseen engineer across the ocean, the man whose design was rewriting the physics of destruction. 2 men, divided by sea and ideology, yet bound by the same obsession, understanding how things break. There is intelligence in this design, a terrifying simplicity. The Americans have turned impact itself into a weaponized current. Each bomb is, in essence, a conductor of war. I no longer believe we can win by catching up. We must learn to outthink them before they invent again. Days turned into weeks. The arsenal buzzed with restless urgency. One night, an assistant burst into Kuroda's office, holding a small glass disc. Sir, look, if pressure is applied, it generates voltage. Kuroda's eyes widened. Quartz, piezoelectric reaction. They rigged a crude demonstration. A single quartz fragment connected by wire to a light bulb. When Endo pressed it with a brass rod, the bulb flickered faintly to life. The engineers stood in silence. So, this is how it works, Endo said softly. A spark from force. Kuroda nodded. Impact becomes energy. Energy becomes detonation. The men exchanged a glance, heavy with awe and dread. Tokyo Arsenal confirms mechanism similar to piezoelectric initiation. Recommend acceleration of research into quartz production and electrical detonation theory. Obstacles include material scarcity and inadequate precision tools. Endo left the laboratory at dawn. The streets outside were quiet, the city wrapped in grey mist. Children walked to school with satchels patched from old uniforms. He paused to watch them pass, the sound of their laughter faint in the cold air. He thought of Truk again, the lagoon burning, men screaming through smoke, all of it triggered by a sliver of glass the size of a fingernail. "We build bigger ships," he whispered. Late that night, Kuroda called him back to the lab. A telegram had arrived from Rabaul. Another unexploded bomb had been recovered, mostly intact. Arrangements were already underway to ship it to Tokyo. Endo looked down at the telegram, its paper still damp from the coastal humidity. His eyes lingered on the last line. Estimated arrival, April 2nd. Device appears complete. He folded the message slowly. "Then perhaps," he said, "we'll finally see the mind of the weapon." The snow outside had melted into rain. Beneath it, Tokyo's lights flickered dimly under the blackout curtains, a city bracing itself for what was to come. And somewhere deep in the heart of the arsenal, under a single bulb burning through the night, the fragments of an American bomb lay waiting a riddle, forged in steel and electricity. Endo closed his notebook, extinguished the light, and whispered into the darkness. "If destruction can think, then perhaps it can be understood." The crate arrived just after dawn. A dull wooden box, its corners worn from the Pacific journey, stamped in red ink, "Explosive material handle with extreme caution." A dozen men gathered as it was carried into the ordnance testing chamber, a subterranean vault deep beneath the arsenal complex. The air was cold, the walls thick with concrete and lined with copper shielding, Japan's most secure facility for handling foreign munitions. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Endo stood at the observation window with Dr. Masaru Kuroda, hands clasped behind his back. "This," Kuroda murmured, "is the most intact specimen ever recovered." The lid came off with a creak. Inside, cushioned by straw and oilcloth, lay an American ANM 64 500-pound general-purpose bomb, still scarred from impact, but with its nose section nearly pristine. The fuze assembly gleamed faintly in the lamplight complex, alien, beautiful. Endo leaned closer, eyes tracing the smooth contour of the aluminum nose cone. There were no screws, no visible joints, only a small circular plate sealed with resin, from which a copper wire ran into the casing. "How did they make this so clean?" Endo whispered. "They must use machine lathes beyond our tolerance," Kuroda said softly. "Each surface is perfect. It is surgical. Specimen identified as U.S. 500-pound GP bomb, ANM 64. Fuze recovered intact, likely model M103A1 variant. Contains quartz or similar piezoelectric initiator wired to electric detonator. Mechanism remains sensitive to mechanical shock. Further disassembly to be performed under isolation." For 3 hours the team worked in silence, documenting every contour with calipers and sketches. Endo noted the precision of the soldering, the symmetry of the copper coil, the minute threading within the detonator housing. Every part spoke of industrial mastery. Finally, Kuroda's lead technician, a thin man named Tanabe, adjusted his magnifying loupe and murmured, "Sir, look here. The wire is attached directly to this crystal segment. If struck, the crystal compresses, creating an electric pulse." He turned to Kuroda. "This current could fire the detonator instantly." Kuroda's eyes flickered with astonishment. "Piezoelectric response, from quartz." Endo exhaled slowly. "So it's true. The Americans have learned to make impact itself produce electricity." They continued through the afternoon. One of the engineers connected the recovered fuse to a dummy detonator and oscilloscope. A small quartz piece, clear and fragile, was mounted between copper contacts. When tapped lightly with a brass rod, the gauge needle leapt sharply. "Voltage!" Tanabe exclaimed. "Enough to ignite an electric detonator," Kuroda said grimly. The room fell silent. Confirmed piezoelectric detonation. Principle. Fuse activates instantaneously upon impact. Estimated reaction time, 1.2 milliseconds. Device reliability exceeds mechanical fuses by wide margin. Construction suggests precision manufacturing at scale. That night, Endo walked alone through the arsenal courtyard. The wind carried the faint hum of generators from distant workshops. He looked up. Tokyo's sky was dark, the stars dimmed by blackout regulations. He thought of Truk again, the fireball that consumed the Kiyosumi Maru, the impossible speed of the detonation. Now he knew why. But knowledge brought no comfort. "They've turned physics into a trigger," he wrote in his log. "A bomb that responds faster than a man can blink." He imagined the American engineer who conceived it somewhere in California, perhaps at a Lockheed or Douglas plant, sketching calmly while cities burned oceans away. Two men, never to meet, bound by invisible rivalry. On April 6th, the arsenal staged a controlled test. A duplicate fuse assembly, non-lethal, was mounted inside a steel fixture. A weighted hammer simulated the force of impact. "Proceed," Kuroda ordered. The hammer dropped. A sharp click echoed, followed by a crackle of blue-white light. The oscilloscope needle spiked violently. Tanabe swallowed hard. "Instantaneous, sir. No delay." Kuroda turned to Endo. "There is your answer, Commander. The Americans have perfected detonation speed. No mechanical delay, no failure from vibration. A crystal nothing more translates motion into energy," Endo said quietly. "And that is why our ships explode before we even hear the impact. Tokyo, Arsenal confirms U.S. use of piezoelectric fuses in aerial ordnance. Devices employ quartz crystals to produce electric charge upon impact, initiating instant detonation. Recommend urgent investigation into synthetic quartz production and electrical detonation countermeasures." Later that evening, the two men shared a small flask of sake in the term lab, their faces lit only by the glow of the instrument panels. "Hiroshi," Kuroda said quietly, dropping the formality for once, "you realize what this means? Every future bomb, every shell could be guided by electricity. The age of chemistry is ending." Endo took a slow sip. "And the age of precision begins." He set the cup down and stared at the disassembled fuse. "Do you think they understand what they've made?" Kuroda looked at the quartz crystal lying on the tray, a tiny thing, almost beautiful in its stillness. "No," he said. "Not fully, but they will, and so must we." The following morning, Endo convened a new research directive. Teams were assigned to test local sources of quartz, while others experimented with crude substitutes, sugar, glass, ceramics, even volcanic crystal from Kyushu. All failed. The purity required was far beyond domestic capacity. "Our entire empire," Endo wrote bitterly, "and not one factory can cut a crystal to this tolerance." Yet he refused to give up. Night after night, he returned to the lab, sketching improved detonator housings, drafting speculative diagrams for field countermeasures, shock baffles, delayed armor spacers, anything to buy ships an extra fraction of a second. Kuroda watched him work in silence. He understood that the fight had shifted from the seas to the workbench. He studies their design as though deciphering a sacred text. But I see it differently. The Americans did not invent intelligence in a bomb, they merely removed ignorance from it. They let nature's smallest law do their killing for them. Days later, Endo received orders from Navy headquarters. He was to prepare a full technical dossier for the General Staff, explaining in layman's terms why American bombs were so devastating. He stared at the order for a long time before setting down his pen. "Because," he wrote finally, "they detonate the moment they understand they've touched something alive." The arsenal grew quieter in the following weeks. Air raid sirens wailed in the distance. Engineers packed their findings into steel cases marked experimental, not for field use. Yet for Endo, one truth lingered in the stillness of the laboratory. The war's future would not be decided by admirals or pilots, but by men who understood how to turn pressure into power, men who could make a crystal speak in sparks. He looked once more at the recovered fuse, its quartz heart catching the lamplight. "You are small," he whispered, "but you end empires." And in that moment, the bomb on his table no longer felt like an enemy's creation. It felt like the future itself, waiting to be heard. The sea at Yokosuka was quiet that morning, deceptively peaceful. Gulls wheeled over the docks, their cries lost beneath the clang of shipyard hammers. From the upper balcony of the Naval Technical Center, Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Endo watched the grey silhouettes of cruisers slip out toward the Pacific, their decks still blackened from hurried repainting. Each ship carried his thoughts. Each one, he feared, was already a grave waiting to be written. It had been nearly 2 months since the discovery at Truk, and the Japanese Navy still struggled to comprehend the full scope of what the Americans had achieved. The piezoelectric fuse, that thinking bomb, had forced every branch of research into a frenzy. Endo's reports had reached even the Naval General Staff. Some dismissed it as technical exaggeration. Others called it a weapon of science fiction. But Endo had seen the truth flare against the Truk sky. Now, surrounded by draftsmen and metallurgists, he was tasked with the impossible. Create a countermeasure. Immediate development of defensive countermeasures against U.S. electrical impact fuses. Priority considerations: deck armor reinforcement, fuse decoupling layers, and induced charge interference. Lieutenant Commander Endo to supervise experimental tests at Yokosuka Naval Technical Center. The first concept was simple: delay the detonation. Endo's engineers theorized that if the fuse activated instantaneously upon contact, perhaps a thin, sacrificial layer of armor could absorb the initial pulse before the bomb's main casing struck the critical structure below. They tested with steel plates mounted at incremental spacing. Crude replicas of the American fuse, fashioned with local quartz and hand-wired detonators, were dropped from the arsenal's test tower. The results were sobering. Each impact triggered detonation faster than any mechanical shield could react. The mock bombs shattered the top plate before the electric signal even had time to dissipate. "It's not impact we can stop," Endo muttered, watching through the observation slit. "It's recognition. The moment this fuse knows it has struck something, it kills." Dr. Kuroda, observing beside him, only nodded grimly. Tests have shown 218. Two-layer armor configuration failed. Time delay between contact and detonation is less than 1.5 milliseconds. No measurable improvement in survivability. Concept A terminated. They tried next to confuse the fuse itself, to blind it. An idea emerged. Create a surface coating of soft material, rubber, cork, or even soaked cloth that would disperse the shock and reduce the electrical impulse transmitted through the quartz. In theory, it could prevent full compression of the crystal. In practice, it was disastrous. The bombs struck and detonated just the same, sometimes even more violently as the soft layer amplified the shockwave inward. "The fuse doesn't care about what it hits," Kuroda said quietly after the 10th failed trial. "It only cares that it hits." As the days wore on, Endo began to see the futility not as failure, but as revelation. The Americans had built something elemental, not a clever mechanism, but a weapon that obeyed physics itself. You could not trick a law of nature. That evening, a coded telegram arrived from Rabaul. Endo read it twice before setting it down. Confirmed loss of destroyer Arashi. Direct hit from 500-pound bomb. Witnesses report instantaneous detonation upon contact with aft gun deck. Total loss, no survivors. He folded the paper slowly. The Arashi had been one of the Navy's best, swift, modern, proud, gone in a heartbeat. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the lights. Then Kuroda spoke. "Hiroshi." Even if we can't stop these bombs, perhaps we can learn from them. You mean copy them? No, Kuroda said. Adapt the principle. If we can create our own electrical fuse, our aerial bombs could rival theirs in precision. Endo stared at the fragments of quartz on his desk, the same translucent pieces that had started it all. To fight the Americans, we must become them, he said bitterly. But to become them, we must first think like them. Proposal initiated for experimental Japanese piezoelectric fuse, Project Shinrai. Objective: instantaneous detonation capability for Navy Type 99 bombs. Initial obstacle: lack of synthetic quartz and vacuum-sealed wiring. Progress estimated: 12-18 months minimum. Endo attended a strategy conference that week at the Yokosuka Naval Command Hall. Officers spoke in circles about tactics, fleet dispersal, and courage. No one mentioned materials science or electric fuses. When his turn came to present, Endo unrolled a single blueprint, a cross-section of the American fuse. "This," he said flatly, "is why your ships die before you can fire back." The room shifted uncomfortably. An admiral frowned. "Are you suggesting victory depends on glass?" Endo met his gaze. "Yes, sir. On glass that thinks faster than steel." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Afterward, Kuroda found him in the corridor, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. "You've made enemies," Kuroda warned. "Then I'm finally doing something right," Endo said, exhaling. He stared out through the narrow window at the harbour below, where destroyers rocked in their berths under a bruised sunset. He could see their decks gleaming with fresh paint. But he knew it was illusion cosmetic defiance against the inevitable. "We keep building walls," he said, "and the Americans keep building keys. The countermeasure project will not succeed. Not because of incompetence, but because we are trying to slow light with armor. The Americans have understood something profound, that the smallest vibration can unleash destruction faster than thought. I fear this realization will end us before we can evolve to meet it." Weeks later, a Navy messenger arrived with transfer orders. Endo was being reassigned to the frontline technical staff at Rabaul, the same place where the next waves of U.S. bombers were expected to strike. Kuroda tried to protest, but Endo only smiled faintly. "Perhaps it's better I see my theories tested where it matters," he said. Before dawn the next morning, he walked alone across the Yokosuka pier, the wind whipping his coat. He paused beside the destroyer Yukikaze, her decks glistening with dew. He reached out, touching the cold metal rail, the same steel that would soon face the same invisible spark. "Let's see," he whispered. "If the mind of a weapon can be understood before it destroys us all." As the transport ship pulled away, the engineers at the arsenal returned to their benches, still chasing the mirage of a countermeasure. The failed test plates gleamed faintly under the morning light, mute reminders that even brilliance had limits when pressed against inevitability. And beneath the laboratory's dim lights, the recovered American fuse sat in its glass case, unarmed but eternal, a fragment of the future that no armor could stop. The morning fog clung low over Simpson Harbor, muffling the roar of engines from the dispersed airstrips. Rabaul had become a fortress under siege. Japanese soldiers patrolled the docks with rifle slings tight, while engineers hurried between warehouses of bombs and crates of spare parts. Yet even in this apparent strength, a quiet fear lingered. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Endo arrived aboard a battered transport, his duffel bag heavy with blueprints and fragments of American fuses. He stepped onto the tarmac, eyes scanning the runway where Mitsubishi A6M0s lined up like black teeth. Pilots nodded grimly. They had heard rumors of a weapon that struck before it touched, and the air was thick with tension. Endo wasted no time. Within hours, he was at the forward technical depot, where a team of engineers worked feverishly under the harsh glow of kerosene lamps. Their task: prepare defenses and adapt knowledge of U.S. ordnance to Japanese munitions. "If a cruiser can be shredded in a heartbeat," Endo began, holding up a fragment of fused quartz, "then no deck, no bulkhead, will save us." We must learn from this mind of a bomb before it learns us. The engineers examined every fragment, tracing the intricate connections of wire, crystal, and detonator. Endo supervised as they attempted small-scale replications, crude imitations of the American fuses pressed into Type 99 bombs. Initial tests were chaotic. The detonation was instantaneous, sometimes unexpectedly violent, scattering the workshop with shards of steel and smoke. Beyond the technical work, reports streamed in from the front lines. Destroyers in the harbour had been struck with uncanny precision. Bombers that approached from high altitude sometimes vanished entirely under the flash of a single impact. Endo catalogued every report, comparing it to the Truk incidents. Every strike, every explosion. It is no accident, he wrote. The Americans are not merely dropping bombs, they are orchestrating destruction with honor, knowledge we cannot yet grasp. By evening, Endo and his team had achieved a minor breakthrough. A modified fuse that could detonate almost simultaneously upon contact, though on a smaller scale than the U.S. version. It was enough to demonstrate the principle, but insufficient for combat deployment. Still, it provided a glimmer of understanding. Outside, the tropical night pressed down. Anti-aircraft batteries hummed faintly in preparation for the expected U.S. raids. Endo stood on the balcony of the depot, watching searchlights sweep the harbour. The faint smell of salt, oil, and smouldering wood filled the air, a reminder of what was at stake. We can copy a machine, he murmured to himself, but we cannot yet copy the mind that built it. And beneath that thought, the islands themselves seemed to shudder, aware that the war above them had learned a new, terrifying language, one of instantaneous judgment, carried on the wings of a P-38 Lightning. By late summer, the arsenal smelled of varnish and solder, an olfactory map of frantic work. Windows were masked, lamps run around the clock, and the central workshop hummed like a hive. On the main bench lay the remains of every piezoelectric experiment attempted since Truk. Fractured glass, scorched copper, charred bakelite, and a dozen ruined detonator housings. Each failure had a neat tag: Test 1-7, a thermal rupture; Test 2, 1C arcing failure; Test 2, 9 premature discharge. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Endo moved through the room with a ledger under his arm. He had spent months not merely reading parts but learning their grammar, the way a copper strand bent, how a crystal fractured under asymmetric load, how the tiniest impurity could extinguish an electric impulse. Tonight he walked to the bench where Dr. Masaru Kuroda and a cluster of technicians huddled over a microscope. "What do we have?" Endo asked. Kuroda lifted his head, his face pale in the lamplight. "Not what we hoped. The natural quartz we can harvest from domestic sources is full of occlusions. It will produce a voltage sometimes, but the output is inconsistent. The American crystals are cut and treated to tolerances we cannot approach." Endo tapped the ledger. "And synthetic?" Kuroda's jaw tightened. "We have furnaces, we have men, but synthetic quartz of the purity required for reliable piezoelectric initiation needs ultra-pure silica, vacuum-controlled growth, and cutting with tolerances of microns. We do not have the chemical feedstock in quantity, nor the instruments for the finishing." Project Shinrai. Synthetic quartz production, presently infeasible. Primary limiting factors: lack of high-purity silica, CO2, shortage of copper for precision wiring, absence of vacuum furnaces and diamond lathes for cut and finish. Recommendation: prioritize procurement of foreign sources and reassign highest-grade silicas to ordnance development. They tried substitutes. Ceramics doped with barium titanate produced a measurable voltage but cracked under repeated shock. Tourmaline from Hokkaido showed piezoelectric properties, but could not be cut to size without shattering. The men experimented with multiple permutations, varying contact geometries, buffered detonation housings, pressure lenses to concentrate impact. Each iteration taught them something new, but none replicated the American fuse's reliability. At midnight, a junior technician, Sakai, brought Kuroda a small scrap salvaged from a captured supply shipment. an unfamiliar alloy plate stamped with tiny tolerances marks. Under the microscope, the metal's grain structure was unlike anything forged in Japan's factories. The machining finish was hairline fine. Kuroda whistled softly. They don't just have materials. They have an entire supply chain engineered to deliver parts to tolerance. A craftsman in America uses a tool we cannot even imagine here. Endo sat back and considered the full picture. The problem was not a single missing element, but the systemic absence of an industrial ecosystem. Vacuum chambers, ultra-pure chemicals, precision abrasives. The measurement culture of tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. They could emulate a design on paper, but the factory that would make 10,000 identical copies was the real weapon. We understood the principle quickly. The difficulty was not in the idea, but in reproducing the process at scale. Our factories made excellent swords. They were not set up to spool copper wire by microns or polish crystals to optical tolerances. In 1943 Japan, raw materials failed us more often than enemy bullets. Endo convened a meeting with metallurgists, procurement officers, and munitions manufacturers. The table filled with men in uniforms and suits, each carrying the same exhausted look. He laid a piece of American-dressed quartz on the table like a relic. "Gentlemen," Endo said, "this is not simply a question of copying a part. It is a question of supply chains and tolerances. If we had American copper, vacuum glass blowers, the diamond abrasives to finish a cut, and the chemicals to purify silica, perhaps we could build their fuse. As it stands, we cannot." A procurement officer cleared his throat. "We can try to divert high-grade copper from other uses, but the army already requisitioned the majority. Tungsten, nickel, and electrolytic copper are stretched thin." Endo's hand tightened around the quartz until his knuckles blanched. "Then we must choose. Divert industry or accept fragility." No one wanted to choose. Industry meant cannibalizing tanks and ships for parts. Refusal meant watching more Kiyosumimarus burn. We know the blueprint. We can draw it with perfect fidelity. But a drawing is not a factory. The American advantage rests less in genius than in the ability to make genius repeatably. The empire lacks the inputs to turn knowledge into ordnance. Kuroda returned to the port, microscope, and rotated the reclaimed quartz until the faint lamplight caught an internal plane. Tiny striations, micro-inclusions, ran like rivers within the stone, each a potential failure point. He thought of the young technicians at Rabal experimenting with their crude imitations, the men whose hands had been scarred by premature detonations. He set the crystal down carefully and covered it with a small glass jar. "We have learned the language," he said softly, "but we still lack the alphabet." Endo walked to the window and looked across the arsenal yard where the workers trudged through dusk. He remembered the children on the street and the transport ship leaving Truk months ago. He realized the war had become, in the most literal sense, a contest of factories and chemical plants, and that Japan's map of resources was shrinking every day. "We will keep trying," he said finally. "Not because I believe we will win by copying, but because understanding is the only defense left." Kuroda nodded. "And perhaps, somewhere, another genius will invent a way to make the small things out of less. Until then, we wait and we learn." In the weeks that followed, the arsenal shifted priorities. A small cadre focused on materials science, others on detonation housing to reduce sensitivity, and a handful on tactical doctrine, how to disperse ships differently, how to camouflage buoyant targets, how to stagger fuel storage. The crystal blueprint remained on Endo's desk under a lamp, a tiny, fragile truth that both illuminated and tormented. He would carry it with him into the months of raids ahead, an emblem of an equation he could not solve alone. The country had the minds to understand the bomb, but lacked the means to make the understanding into metal. The rain had fallen steadily for 2 days, streaking the narrow streets outside Yokosuka with mud and soot. Inside the arsenal, a different storm raged. Technical reports stacked in neat columns across the benches, their margins annotated with calculations, warnings, and frustrated scratches. The Japanese engineers, now intimately familiar with the Two's mechanism faced a paradox. Understanding the enemy's device better than they could ever hope to replicate it. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Endo sat at a long, metal desk under a flickering lamp. A sheet of parchment lay before him, its edges curling slightly from the damp air. On it he had begun drafting a letter addressed to Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, commander of the combined fleet, but the letter remained unfinished. He had written, "Sir, after months of analysis, it is my duty to report the following regarding the American bomb fuses recovered from Truk and Rabaul," then paused. It was not hesitation born of fear of reprimand. It was the recognition of futility. Every line written was tempered by a single, unshakable truth. Japan could describe the bomb, it could diagram it, it could calculate its crystal lattice, but it could not manufacture it. Not at scale, not with the precision, not with the materials available in wartime Japan. Observation. American bombs utilize a high-reliability piezoelectric fuse system. Analysis indicates reliance on ultra-pure synthetic quartz, precision cut to micron tolerances. Manufacturing reproducibility is critical to effectiveness. Current Japanese capabilities are insufficient to replicate materials, processes, and tolerances. Endo turned to Dr. Masaru Kuroda, who leaned over a small microscope, examining the remnants of a detonator recovered from a U.S. supply cache. "Masaru," Endo said quietly, "we must decide if this knowledge is actionable or a distraction. Can our report change production directives?" Kuroda shook his head. "Not directly. If we report, the Navy may demand we divert resources we do not possess. If we do nothing, more cruisers and transports will continue to burn." The room was silent for a moment. Outside, the rain tapped against the metal roof, a rhythmic reminder of the war marching forward regardless of human plans. Endo finally scribbled a note in the margins of his draft. "Emphasize analytical understanding. Avoid operational recommendations that cannot be fulfilled." It was a compromise between honesty and survival. A letter sent without action might be read and disregarded. A letter sent with impossible instructions could provoke blame. We observed that American fuses were not merely components, but a system of controlled precision. Each part, each crystal, each wire and housing contributed to a chain reaction that could not fail. Japanese industry could not reproduce this chain without foreign inputs. The only solution available at the time was to modify tactics, not technology. Meanwhile, in Yokohama, procurement officers struggled with the limits of supply. Copper, tungsten, and high-grade silica were being rationed to priority projects: radar, torpedoes, and fighter aircraft. Even if the engineers could reproduce the designs theoretically, the raw materials did not exist. Endo knew this, but it was not something easily conveyed on paper. He thought of the letter he had begun, the draft untouched for days. He imagined the admiral reading it, seeing lines of precise diagrams and careful analyses, and wondering why Japanese ships continued to burn with uncanny speed. He wondered if the admiral would understand that knowledge alone could not save them. Attempted synthesis of piezoelectric quartz. Output voltage inconsistent. Crystal fractures during lapping. Copper wire purity insufficient. Vacuum conditions cannot be maintained. Summary. Replication failure. Endo turned the draft over in his hands. The pen scratched the parchment as he wrote, then erased, then wrote again. The letter became an exercise in futility, a record of insight the nation could not use. Finally, he folded it neatly, placed it in an envelope, and set it aside. The envelope would never leave his desk. He understood the weight of it. In his mind, the letter was a silent witness to a failing war effort, a chronicle of limitations rather than errors. Every page he could have sent was a confession. The Japanese engineers understood the American bomb better than anyone in the fleet, yet understanding alone could not stop the destruction. I remember the draft letter well. Hiroshi believed in the principle of recording truth even if action could not follow. I argued for expediency. for sending a report that would at least request more resources. But what could more resources have done? We lacked the chemical purity, the diamond abrasives, the industrial culture to produce what the Americans had perfected. Our letter, therefore, remained unsent not out of fear, but out of recognition. Endo walked through the workshop late that night, past benches littered with microscopes, lathes, and salvaged components. The men worked in silence, their movements methodical, almost ritualistic, as if the act of attempting replication itself carried moral weight. He paused at a small table where a few salvaged crystals lay under glass jars. One had a fine hairline fracture. Another, partially oxidized, reflected lamplight like liquid ice. He touched the glass gently, recalling the ships that had burned in Truk, Rabaul, and later in the Solomons. Each crystal held the secret of the destruction, tiny, precise, almost invisible. "We know the enemy's strength," Endo said to no one in particular. But knowing is not the same as possessing. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city smelled of wet asphalt and smoke from distant factories. Endo returned to his desk, took up the envelope, and set it carefully in the drawer marked Confidential Project Shinrai. He closed the drawer, leaving the letter unread and unsent. The decision weighed heavily on him. But he knew it was the only rational choice. The engineers would continue their experiments, documenting every failure and every insight. The letter remained a silent witness, a testament to what was known, what could not be made, and what the war had revealed about the limitations of an empire stretched too thin. We may never send the letter. Perhaps we will never be asked for it. Yet, its existence, drafted and unsent, is a record of what we have learned. Japan may continue to burn her ships, not for lack of intelligence, but for lack of industrial means. The war is not won in the mind alone. By the end of October, the engineers had catalogued every component recovered from Truk, every material property measured, and every failed replication noted. The letter lay in the drawer like a ghost proof of knowledge and a symbol of restraint. Endo knew that in another world, with resources abundant and time sufficient, the letter could have changed tactics, perhaps even outcomes. But in 1943 Japan, knowledge without means was powerless, and the unsent letter became both their confession and their shield. By early November, the reality of the U.S. bomb fuses had settled into the daily consciousness of Japanese naval engineers. The trials at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal had yielded exhaustive data. Every component measured, every crystal tested, every assembly examined. And yet, with all that knowledge, the conclusion was unavoidable. The fuse could not be reproduced. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Endo and Dr. Masaru Kuroda sat before a bank of diagrams that traced the entire chain of detonation from initial strike to crystal excitation to explosive ignition. Each diagram was meticulously annotated with tolerances, material specifications, and failure probabilities. "The Americans," Kuroda said, pointing at a magnified schematic of the detonator, "they are not engineers in the conventional sense. They are artists. Look at the alignment of these crystals. Even a few microns off, and the fuse fails." Yet, they never fail. Endo nodded, his eyes scanning a line of marginal notes. Material: synthetic quartz. Purity is greater than 99.999%. Cut angle tolerance, plus or minus 0.02 degrees. Shock resistance, 600 G. Each figure was beyond the practical capacity of Japanese industrial processes in 1943. Diamond abrasives to cut the quartz were in short supply, and maintaining vacuum conditions during assembly was nearly impossible outside specialized laboratories. Replication attempts aborted. Materials not available. Tolerances unobtainable. Any attempt at mass production likely to yield 0% functional fuses. Tactical recommendation: adjust defensive tactics. Avoid direct engagement in open waters where U.S. bombing capabilities are present. At Rabaul, The engineers' findings had been sent along with salvaged bomb fragments, creating a tense correspondence between the front lines and Tokyo. The commanding officers of the combined fleet received the reports with polite acknowledgement, but little practical guidance. They could see the brilliance of the U.S. devices, but they could not implement a solution. The Rabaul officers, once confident in their ability to fortify positions against air attack, were forced into tactical improvisation. Cargo ships were dispersed across smaller anchorages, fuel lines were camouflaged, and anti-aircraft defenses were incrementally strengthened. Still, the Americans' bombs struck with precision that seemed almost preordained. "It is as if they know exactly where to hit," wrote a lieutenant in Rabaul. "And no matter what we do, our ships burn like kindling. Observations confirm. U.S. Fuzes utilize a fully self-contained initiation system. Piezoelectric crystals produce sufficient voltage upon impact to detonate explosive with near-absolute reliability. Reproducing system requires A. Ultra-pure quartz. B. Precision lapping to plus or minus 0.02 degrees. C. Insulation from thermal and mechanical shock. D. Industrial assembly processes unavailable in current Japan. Conclusion: impossible under wartime constraints. Endo walked the dimly lit workshops late at night. The men worked silently, testing small fragments of detonators under microscopes, recording voltages, shock absorption data, and mechanical tolerances. He watched as one technician carefully slid a tiny quartz crystal into a test rig, then observed it shatter under impact. "Even if we had the material," Endo muttered, "we lack the craftsmanship on a mass scale. 100 functional fuses is impossible, 1,000 unimaginable." Kuroda, nearby, sighed. "We are documenting brilliance we cannot duplicate. We are historians of the enemy's success, not participants in it." The irony weighed on them. Japan had the knowledge, but the war demanded implementation. And in this theatre of operations, understanding alone could not save men, ships, or supply lines. The P-38 raids at Rabaul continue with remarkable accuracy. Reports of cruiser and transport losses persist. Salvaged ordnance confirms functioning piezoelectric fuses. Reproduction trials futile. Tactical adaptation required. At the same time, the Navy began to confront a harsher reality: the limits of improvisation. Camouflage and dispersal slowed losses but could not prevent them. Even minor hits from U.S. bombs led to catastrophic fires in fuel stores and ammunition holds. Engineers and commanders alike understood the mechanism of destruction, yet the ability to stop it eluded them entirely. The combined reports from Truk, Rabaul, and the arsenals in Tokyo painted a sobering picture. Japan's industrial base had no pathway to compete with American precision engineering. Ships would continue to burn, convoys would continue to scatter, and the war, increasingly, was being fought in a realm Japan could observe, but not influence. We spent months measuring, testing, and recording the American fuses. We understood every aspect of the design: the crystals, the tolerances, the electrical path. And yet, even after understanding, we could not replicate it. Our factories lacked materials, our techniques lacked precision. It was a painful lesson. Knowledge alone does not equal power. By late November, Endo made a final record: a catalogue of every failed experiment, every piece of data, every measurement of the enemy fuse. He labelled the archive project Shinrai Trust in Japanese. It was an ironic title. The Americans' bombs were a system that Japan could trust to fail them, but Japan could not trust itself to replicate it. "The enemy's fuses are a mirror," he wrote, reflecting our own inadequacy. "We know what must be done, but we cannot do it." Engineers continued to attempt marginal improvements in defensive tactics, adjusting ship formations, revising anti-aircraft protocols, and reinforcing fuel storage procedures. But the truth remained: the bombs were unstoppable in their precision, and no amount of ingenuity could overcome the industrial limitations Japan faced.